There is a scene in almost every mob movie ever made. A boss sits across a table from someone who has broken the rules. There is a quiet conversation, maybe a glass of wine, maybe a long pause, and then a gunshot, a garrote, a body in the trunk of a car. Problem solved. Order restored. Hollywood has been telling you that story for 60 years, and it is not wrong. Exactly. But it is missing everything that happened before the gunshot. Everything that determined whether the gunshot happened at all. Everything that made the difference between a man who walked out of the room alive and a man who didn't. Because the real American Mafia did not run on violence. Violence was the last resort. Violence was what happened when everything else had already failed. What the Mafia actually ran on. What kept it functioning, profitable, and largely invisible for nearly half a century, was a set of rules so specific, so detailed, and so ruthlessly enforced that they governed almost every waking hour of every made member's life. Rules about who you could talk to, who you could do business with, who you were allowed to kill, and who you absolutely could not touch under any circumstances, no matter what they did to you. Rules about how you introduced yourself in a room full of strangers. Rules about what words you were allowed to say out loud. Rules about money. Who got paid, how much, in what order, and what happened to you if you shorted somebody by even a few $100s. Rules about your wife, your girlfriend, your children, your priest. Rules that the government spent 40 years trying to document, that informants risked their lives to describe, and that the organization itself spent decades pretending didn't exist. The movies gave you the gunshot. Tonight we are going to show you everything that came before it. Before we go any further, hit subscribe right now if you are not already part of the Syndicate Files community. Every week we go this deep into the real machinery of organized crime, past the myth, past the movie, into the documented record of what these organizations actually were and how they actually work. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see where you are watching from tonight, and share this one, because what we are about to get into is something most people have never heard explained this clearly. Hit subscribe, hit the like button, and let's go. To understand the rules of the American Mafia, you need to understand why rules existed at all. In the 1920s, before the Commission, before the Five Families, before any formal structure, organized, crime in American cities was exactly what the name suggests, organized only loosely, criminal, entirely. The gangs of that era operated on a simple principle. If you could take something, you took it. If someone stood in your way, you killed them. If a rival gang moved into your territory, you went to war. The result was chaos, constant, expensive, attention-generating chaos, wars between Italian and Irish gangs, wars between Sicilian and Neapolitan factions, wars between individual bosses over individual blocks, wars that put policemen in the newspapers and politicians on the radio demanding action, wars that were genuinely bad for business. Lucky Luciano understood something that almost no one around him understood. The violence was not the point, the money was the point, and the violence was actively getting in the way of the money. In 1931, after engineering the murders of old guard bosses who refused to modernize, the event known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, Luciano assembled the framework that would govern organized crime in America for the next 50 years. 5 families in Newark, a commission of bosses from major cities across the country, defined territories, dispute resolution mechanisms, and most critically, rules, specific, enforceable, universally acknowledged rules that every made member of every family was required to know and required to follow. The first and most important rule was the one that made all the others possible. Omertà, the code of silence. Not merely the instruction not to cooperate with law enforcement. That was the obvious minimum. Omertà was something deeper. It was the prohibition against discussing Cosa Nostra, the organization, its structure, its members, its activities, with anyone who was not a made member. Not your wife, not your children, not your priest, not your oldest friend from the neighborhood, even if you had known him since childhood, even if he had done business with the family for decades, even if you trusted him with your life in every other context. The organization did not exist. You did not belong to it. You could not acknowledge its existence, your membership in it, or the existence of any other member. To anyone who had not been formally initiated, this rule was not merely procedural. It was the foundation of everything. Every other rule depended on it. As long as Omertà held, as long as the men inside the organization stayed silent about its existence and operations, the organization was functionally invisible to law enforcement and nearly impossible to prosecute. The movies show you men who talk constantly, who explain the rules to each other in diners and social clubs, who make speeches about loyalty and respect, while sitting surrounded by 20 other obvious mobsters. The real rule was that none of that conversation was supposed to happen at all. Before a man could be bound by the rules, he had to be brought inside them. The initiation ceremony of La Cosa Nostra was described publicly for the first time in 1963, when Joseph Valachi testified before the United States Senate. It was described again in FBI surveillance recordings captured in 1989 in Medford, Massachusetts, when agents recorded an actual initiation ceremony for the first time in history. Both descriptions, separated by 26 years, matched each other almost exactly. What the movies get wrong is not the ceremony itself. It is the selection process that preceded it. A man could not ask to be made. You were not permitted to campaign for membership, hint at your desire for membership, or in any way communicate to existing members that you wanted in. The rules were explicit. A man who sought membership was disqualified by the seeking of it. The right men did not ask. They were asked. Before that asking happened, the candidate was observed, not for weeks, not for months, for years, sometimes for more than a decade. The men above him watched how he handled money. Did he pay what he owed on time, without complaint? They watched how he handled pressure. Did he stay quiet when law enforcement came around, or did he talk? They watched how he handled other men. Was he reliable? Was he calm? Was he capable of doing what needed to be done without making a scene or a mistake? They watched whether he could keep a secret in an organization whose survival depended entirely on secrecy. A man's ability to stay silent was not merely a virtue. It was the primary qualification for membership. And there was another rule that Hollywood has, almost never shown accurately. To be made, you had to be of Italian descent, specifically. In the original formulation, you had to be of full Sicilian descent on both sides. This requirement relaxed over time. By mid-century, most families required only that a man's father be Italian. But it never disappeared. It was not merely ethnic preference. It was a security calculation. The theory was that a man with deep roots in the Italian-American community had family, reputation, and cultural ties that bound him more tightly to silence. He had something to lose beyond himself. He had a community that would bear the consequences of his choices. There was one additional requirement that the movies almost never depict accurately. You had to have killed someone, not figuratively, not as a metaphor for toughness. You had to have committed murder, or at minimum participated directly in a murder, before you could be formally initiated. The act was not just a test of nerve. It was a practical guarantee. A man who had killed on behalf of the family could not testify against it without implicating himself in murder. His silence was not merely a matter of loyalty. It was a matter of survival. The ceremony itself was conducted in a room with existing members present. A gun and a knife were placed on a table. The candidate's trigger finger was pricked with a needle, and blood was drawn. A holy card, typically the image of a saint, was placed in his cupped hands and set on fire. As it burned, he repeated the oath that he entered the organization alive and would leave it only in death, that he would put the family above all other loyalties, including his own blood. That omerta was absolute and eternal. Then the boss, or representative of the boss, spoke the words that formally welcomed him. He was now, as the phrase went, a friend of ours. And from that moment, the full weight of every rule applied to him, permanently, completely, and without exception. The made member who walked out of that initiation ceremony alive entered a world governed by rules that touched virtually every aspect of his existence. The rule about introduction sounds almost absurdly formal to modern ears. But inside the organization, it was a matter of life and death, literally. If you were a made member of one family and you encountered a made member of another family, in a social setting, you could not simply introduce yourself. You could not say your name and shake hands, because neither of you could acknowledge to a stranger that you were a member of Cosa Nostra, and you could not conduct business with another made member without knowing that he was, in fact, made, without knowing that he was bound by the same rules, the same oath, the same obligations. So there was a protocol. A mutual acquaintance who knew both men and was himself made would say, "I want you to meet a friend of mine." That phrase, "friend of mine," was the signal that the man being introduced was not a made member. The introduction meant only that the speaker vouched for him as a trustworthy associate. But if the introducer said, "I want you to meet a friend of ours," that phrase was the formal signal that the man being introduced was initiated. He was bound by the oath. Business could be conducted. Trust, within the rules of the organization, was established. Those three words, mine versus ours, were the difference between a civilian and a made man. And using them incorrectly, in either direction, was a violation of the rules that could get a man killed. If you introduced a made man as a friend of mine, treating him as an ordinary civilian, you were exposing him, potentially identifying him to people who did not know his status. If you introduced an uninitiated associate as a friend of ours, falsely conferring maid status on someone who had not earned it, you were committing a fraud against the organization. That could result in serious consequences for everyone involved. Then there was the rule about money. Every made member who generated income through his criminal activities owed a portion of that income upward through the hierarchy. Associates paid their crew bosses. Crew bosses paid their capos. Capos paid the administration, the consigliere, the underboss, the boss. The boss paid tribute to other bosses where territorial or business arrangements required it. This tribute system was not optional. It was not negotiable, and it was not approximate. Shortchanging your tribute, paying less than you owed, even slightly, even once, was a declaration, whether you intended it that way or not, that you did not respect the man above you. In an organization where respect was not a social nicety, but an operational necessity, where the man above you might need to decide, someday, whether to protect you or let you be killed. Disrespecting him through a short tribute payment was an act of profound stupidity. Men had died for shorting their boss, not spectacularly, not after lengthy deliberation, but simply, they were there, and then they were not there. The rule about drugs shifted over decades, and varied by family. The popular version of the story, that the commission formally banned drug trafficking, is somewhat more complicated than Hollywood presents it. Some families permitted narcotics dealing, others formally prohibited it, not on moral grounds but on pragmatic ones. Drug cases carried severe federal sentences, and men facing long prison terms had more incentive to cooperate with prosecutors. The rule was less a moral prohibition and more risk management calculation. But it was real, and it was enforced, and men who violated it paid consequences. Of all the rules, the one that most thoroughly contradicts the movie version of mob life is the one governing murder. In every mob movie, men are killed casually and constantly. A boss decides someone has crossed him. He makes a phone call. A body turns up. The world moves on. Violence is ambient, automatic, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. The real rules governing murder inside La Cosa Nostra were almost precisely the opposite. Killing a maid member of any family required prior approval from the commission, or at minimum from the boss of the victim's own family. You could not simply decide that a made man needed to die and go ahead and kill him. The murder had to be authorized at the highest level. The reasons had to be presented. Other bosses had to be consulted. A determination had to be made that the killing was justified under the organization's own rules, that the man had committed a violation serious enough to warrant the death penalty under their internal code. This rule was not about sentimentality. It was about stability. Every murder created risk, law enforcement attention, potential witnesses, associates who might become informants out of grief or fear, families demanding vengeance. The chain of consequences that flowed from any killing was long and expensive, and the men who ran the commission understood this with the clarity of long experience. More importantly, unauthorized killings, made men murdered without commission approval, threatened the entire system of trust on which the organization depended. If a boss could kill one of your made members without asking, you had no security. Your men could be picked off one by a rival who simply decided he wanted them dead. The rule requiring authorization was not a nicety. It was the only thing standing between the commission era and a return to the bloody freelance chaos of the 1920s. The prohibition against killing civilians, ordinary people, bystanders, family members of made men was even more absolute. Made men's wives and children were, in theory, completely off limits. The killing of a civilian generated public outrage, political pressure, and law enforcement attention of a scale that no business calculation could justify. There are documented cases of bosses who ordered violence against civilians being sanctioned by the commission, not out of moral feeling but because of the institutional damage such killings caused. And there was one category of killing that was so absolutely forbidden that even raising the possibility was treated as a capital offense. You could not kill a law enforcement officer, not a cop, not a federal agent, not a prosecutor, not a judge. The reasoning was coldly practical. The murder of a law enforcement officer did not solve a problem. It created a problem of an entirely different magnitude. It brought the full institutional weight of the American government down on the organization with an intensity and a duration that no amount of money or political connection could deflect. Men who had corrupt politicians in their pockets and crooked cops on their payroll, men who had been operating with near total impunity for decades, understood with perfect clarity that killing a federal agent would end all of that in an afternoon. The movies love the scene where a mob boss threatens a prosecutor or orders the murder of a police officer. It is dramatically effective. It signals menace. It escalates the story. It almost never happened in reality. And when it did, when a made member of the organization killed a law enforcement officer, the organization's own leadership was often among the most invested parties in making sure he faced consequences, because the alternative was consequences for everyone. This is the aspect of mob life that almost no movie gets right. The rules governing how made members treated women, their own wives, their own girlfriends, and women in general were specific, detailed, and in some ways more strictly enforced than the rules about murder. A made man was expected to be married, not merely in a relationship, married in a church, before God, in the traditional Catholic sense. His wife was to be treated with a specific kind of formal respect. She was never to be brought into knowledge of his activities. She was never to be questioned about him. She was never to be threatened, harassed, insulted, or touched by any other member of the organization under any circumstances. Not to send a message, not in a dispute, not for any reason. The marriage was, in the organizational logic of the Mafia, a social credential. A married man with children was more stable, more invested in the community, more predictable. A man with a wife and children had more to lose, which meant he was more controllable and controllability. In an organization that ran on rules was a virtue. The girlfriend was a different matter. Made men famously kept mistresses. the guma. In the slang of the New York families, this was not merely tolerated, it was, in a strange way, institutionally acknowledged. The girlfriend was a known quantity. Her existence was an open secret. She was often provided for financially through the members' criminal earnings. But the rules about the girlfriend were as specific as the rules about the wife, perhaps more so, because the girlfriend occupied a more precarious position. The girlfriend was never to be brought into social situations where she would encounter the boss or senior members of the family. She was never to know operational details of the members' activities. She was never to be discussed in any environment that was not completely secure. And most critically, she was absolutely never to become a source of domestic instability that interfered with the members' operational reliability. A man who let his girlfriend cause trouble, who got into fights, who created scenes, who drew attention to himself through domestic chaos, was a man who was drawing attention to the organization. That was not a personal failing. That was a professional violation. The deepest rule, the one that the movies occasionally hint at without ever fully explaining, was this: the organization came before everything. Before your wife, before your children, before your parents, before your closest friend. If the boss called, you went, regardless of what was happening in your personal life. If the organization needed something that required you to sacrifice something personal, you sacrificed it. The oath you had taken was not a metaphor. It was a complete reorganization of your loyalties, permanent and without exception. For decades, the FBI's understanding of these rules was fragmentary, built from informant testimony, occasional surveillance fragments, and the rare defection of a made member. Then, on October 29, 1989, federal agents listening to surveillance equipment planted in a Medford, Massachusetts home heard something they had been trying to capture for 30 years. An actual initiation ceremony. The patriarchal crime family of New England was initiating new members. The surveillance recordings captured the entire ceremony, the oath, the burning of the holy card, the formal words of welcome. For the first time in FBI history, agents had recorded proof that the ceremony described by Valachi in 1963 was real, was still being conducted, and had changed almost not at all in the intervening 26 years. The recordings were devastating, not merely as evidence in the criminal cases that followed, though they were that, but as documentation of something deeper. The rules that the organization had maintained for 6 decades had not deteriorated. They had not been modernized, democratized, or loosened by changing times. The men conducting that ceremony in 1989 were using the same words, the same ritual objects, the same formal structure that had been used in 1931. In organizations that operate outside the law, where there is no HR department, no contract enforcement mechanism, no government oversight, the rules survive only if the men in the organization believe in them, not merely comply with them. Believe in them, treat them as genuinely binding. For nearly 60 years, the rules of La Cosa Nostra had been believed in, and then, very slowly, and then all at once, they stopped being believed in. The RICO statute, signed into law in 1970, changed the equation in ways that the Commission's founders had never anticipated and could not have prepared for. Before RICO, prosecuting the Mafia meant prosecuting individual crimes, specific murders, specific robberies, specific extortion payments. It meant finding evidence of a particular act and connecting it to a particular person. The rules, especially Omertà, made this extraordinarily difficult. Men stayed silent, evidence disappeared, witnesses declined to testify, cases collapsed. RICO made membership in the organization itself a crime. Prosecutors no longer needed to prove that a specific boss had ordered a specific murder. They needed to prove that the boss had participated in the pattern of activity of a criminal enterprise, a much lower bar, and one that the organization's own structure made it almost impossible to avoid. The first major RICO trial against the Commission The actual governing council of the five families began in 1985. Prosecutors used decades of FBI surveillance recordings, informant testimony, and the organizational structure of La Cosa Nostra itself as evidence. The defendants were not charged with individual crimes. They were charged with being members of a criminal organization. 8 of the 9 defendants were convicted. Several of the most powerful bosses in American organized crime were sentenced to 100 years in federal prison, and the convictions produced the thing that the rules have been designed for 60 years to prevent: cooperators, not men who were arrested and quietly pleaded guilty to lesser charges, not men who provided limited information in exchange for consideration. Full cooperators, men who agreed to tell the government everything: the structure, the rules, the ceremonies, the murders, the money, in exchange for protection and reduced sentences. Henry Hill, Salvatore Gravano, Philip Linetti, Angelo Leonardo, Joseph Cantalupo, Michael Franzese, man after man who had taken the oath, who had burned the holy card, who had sworn on pain of death to maintain Omertà, standing up in federal court and describing the rules in precise detail to juries of American citizens. The rules had not changed. The belief in the rules had. When men understood that the alternative to cooperation was dying in a federal prison, that the organization they had sworn loyalty to could no longer protect them from the institutional power of the U.S. government, the calculation that had sustained Omertà for 60 years collapsed almost overnight. The Godfather gives you an organization of almost mythic dignity, men of honor, bound by ancient codes, operating by rules that are severe but internally coherent. Even the violence has a kind of tragic grandeur. Even the betrayals are operatic. Here is the thing the movies cannot show you. The rules were not noble. They were not ancient in any meaningful sense. Most of them dated to the 1930s, invented by men who were alive when the automobile was new. They were not rooted in some deep Sicilian tradition of honor. The men who formalized them were, in many cases, barely literate immigrants who had grown up in desperate poverty and stumbled into organized crime because it was the most available path to money and power. The rules were pragmatic. They existed to make the criminal enterprise more efficient and more durable. They existed to minimize the cost of violence, to maximize the benefits of cooperation, to create a structure stable enough that men could make long-term plans and reasonable predictions about whether they would still be alive to execute those plans. They worked for a while because enough men believed in them to enforce them on the men who didn't. And they failed because the American government eventually built a legal framework powerful enough to make the cost of following the rules higher than the cost of breaking them. The last boss of the Bonanno family to run a fully functioning organization, Carmine Galante, was shot dead at a restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn, in July 1979, a cigar still in his mouth. The murder was authorized by the commission, which had decided he had become too dangerous and too independent to be managed by ordinary means. The man who succeeded him oversaw a family that was penetrated so thoroughly by FBI informants that agents eventually had sources at nearly every level of the organization simultaneously. The rules said you trusted your brothers above all others. Your brothers were wearing wires. The rules of La Cosa Nostra were documented most completely not by the FBI, not by journalists, and not by academics, but by the men who had sworn to protect them and then broken them anyway. Salvatore Gravano, Sammy the Bull, was the underboss of the Gambino family, the second most powerful position in what was arguably the most powerful organized crime family in America. He had been made for decades. He had participated in 19 murders. He was, by every measure, one of the most committed members of the organization alive. He testified against John Gotti in 1992. He described the rules in precise and comprehensive detail. The initiation ceremony, the tribute system, the murder authorization process, the protocol for introductions, all of it. His testimony was not the last such testimony. It was one of dozens. By the mid-1990s, made members of every one of the 5 families had cooperated with federal prosecutors. The rules that had been the organization's most closely guarded secret had been described in sworn testimony in federal courts across the country, often multiple times. The organization still exists. Organized crime in American cities did not disappear. The 5 families still function in diminished form in New York. Other organizations, Albanian, Russian, Mexican, and others, have occupied spaces the Italian-American families once controlled. But the specific structure, the specific rules, the specific institutional architecture that Lucky Luciano built in 1931, and that governed organized crime in America for 50 years, that is gone. Dismantled not by a rival organization, not by internal collapse, but by the slow, patient, methodical application of laws specifically designed to do exactly that. The rules were good enough to protect the organization from almost everything. They were not good enough to protect it from men who believed in them. Hollywood gave you the baptism scene, the quiet threat across a restaurant table, the dignified boss in his study delivering judgment. The reality gave you men in a Medford living room, burning a holy card and swearing an oath that federal agents were recording through a hidden microphone in the wall. The reality gave you the underboss of the most powerful family in America, sitting in a federal witness box and describing every rule, every ceremony, and every murder in methodical detail. Because the math had changed and the rules no longer added up. The rules were real. The organization was real. The oath was real. And in the end, none of it was enough, because the thing that made the rules work was belief. And belief is not something you can enforce at gunpoint. If you are still here, if you made it from that cold open all the way to this moment, then you are exactly who the Syndicate Files is built for. Hit subscribe right now. Every week we go this deep, this specific, this far past the version everyone already thinks they know. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share this one with someone who thinks they already understand how the Mafia worked. And drop a comment below. Which rule surprised you most? Which one did you think you already knew and turned out to know wrong? The Syndicate Files. The truth is always darker than the legend.